Hey, what up? Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Tonic podcast. Today, we're going to dive into basically the chaos and tragedy that is kind of carrying out in India right now, as India might be the worst spot for the pandemic during the entirety of the pandemic. In the United States right now, about half of Americans have at least received one dose of the vaccine, but it's not the same in India. India is one of the world's most populous countries. There's a scary mutant strain, and also it's one of the biggest producers of COVID vaccines like AstraZeneca. So today we're just going to cover this and how it's not just an Indian issue, but it's a global issue. So Drew, I hope you're doing well, my friend. Before we get going, I just wanted to put out a few numbers that kind of highlight how bad things are getting in India. Basically, before March, India was barely recording I think it was about 13,000 new cases a day. But now, just yesterday, they were up about 350,000 new cases in one day. And I saw that right now in the world, there's about 650,000 cases just confirmed as of the 26th. And half of the world's cases are in India right now. So, what are your initial thoughts on this? Bad? I don't know.
Well, I think it worries me. It scares me for. I mean, it scares me that you had a country that was up on paper doing so well, and then boom, you have this massive, and a wave. And I even saw. I think it was the Atlantic said it's not even a wave; it's a wall. The way that the rate at which everything exponentially shot up in cases and infection rate and deaths, it's just like boom. It's like getting hit by a truck. And it scares me because the same rhetoric that we're saying in the United States of we're almost out. I even see Gavin Newsom saying, "Hey, we're almost out the light at the end of the tunnel. The light is bright." Everyone's saying we're at the last steps, and it does feel like that. I've gotten vaccinated now, and it does feel like, oh, we're almost out of this thing. But I think people probably thought the same thing in India a few weeks ago, and then bang, you get one. And it's a conglomerate of things that we'll discuss, but it does seem like you have a couple new variants, and then you have just a massive population of 1.4 billion people. So even though they were saying they were vaccinating 3 million a day, that means a lot less when you have 1.4 billion people that need to get vaccinated, as opposed to 3 million a day in the United States is 100 days everyone's vaccinated, but it's way longer than that. It's over a year if you're at that rate in India.
Absolutely, yeah. And I read that quote in the Atlantic as well, where it's not a wave, it's a wall. And I mean, to be completely honest, like going back towards the beginning of the pandemic, I kind of assumed that eventually India was going to get hard hit just because of their population and the quality of life for a lot of their lower income people and their lower caste people. Like, to me, it was just inevitable.
Yeah.
But it's weird that it happened now, mainly because India actually is kind of a leader in vaccine production.
Yeah.
And also they were doing okay previously when other places were getting hit. So to me, though obviously India is a big country with a lot of poverty, I think that needs to be addressed, and that's probably part of the problem. To me, it seems like politics and horrible governance and a bit of nationalism were probably also major culprits in this. I think it was in the Economist article I was reading where they said that India turned down about 200 million doses of Pfizer in exchange for a local vaccine that was being produced inside of India. But unfortunately, there were only 11 million doses available at the time. And it sounds like this kind of phenomenon of vaccine nationalism, this idea of we don't only want to just have our own vaccine, but B, we actually want to export it to others. It sounds like India was kind of careless in this, race for a PR move to basically say, hey, look, we have this vaccine and we're going to do what the US, China, and Russia are doing and exporting it. But it looks like there wasn't enough, and the infrastructure inside of India also is crumbling. And it just seems like this perfect storm of Modi kind of doing the Trump thing, having giant rallies without masks, and then also this kind of vaccine nationalism where, okay, so instead of maybe giving a third of your population the Pfizer vaccine, instead you had 11 million doses of this Indian vaccine that just doesn't even cover it, And there's a quote from this IT executive in Mumbai, and he said last year possibly you knew someone who got COVID. And he said this time it is everyone within spitting distance that either has it, just got over it, or has a close relative who died. So things are getting much worse. And I actually would just say I think it's the government's fault in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, dang, you know, if you're turning down vaccines from Pfizer, I mean, like then you better be damn confident you don't need them. But yeah, look, like 2020 hindsight. I mean, gosh, this whole pandemic is a darkly humorous tale about hindsight is 2020. You know, how many thousands of things we could have done bit differently and better. Um, and this is one of them. I mean, like, you know, not taking Pfizer vaccines, having that vaccine nationalism, and that stems from, you know, 60% of the world's vaccines in general, not just COVID vaccines, but just vaccinations, come from India. So much so that there's even the term that it's the world's pharmacy, right? So yeah, I'm sure they had this idea of like, well, we're the world's pharmacy. Of course, we're gonna supply the stuff to you. We don't need your vaccines. We're gonna supply vaccines to you. Well, it turns out when you have a new variant that is highly contagious, on top of like what you said is from what I'm seeing is a ton of political rallies without masks and like gatherings, you know, like, you know, stuff that obviously increases the infection rate of COVID. It's just like it is like a perfect storm, and it shows that how it only takes a couple factors like that to go from doing super well to doing super poorly. I hope that the United States doesn't have something like this happen soon, right? Because we could have the same perfect storm where it's like a lot of people got vaccinated, but not quite enough. And then, you know, everyone goes out for the summer, and then a new variant from Brazil hits, and then boom, we're back to lockdowns. Like, that would suck. And we're seeing this happen across the world. So we need to. It shows we need to be careful. I have seen though that the response from at least some like the global superpowers has been okay, has been good. I saw that the Biden administration is now exporting vaccines to India. Again, that's because thankfully we are in a position in the United States where we are so vaccine rich that we can export some out. China has also offered to supply some vaccinations to India now, which is a really good thing, especially considering how contentious the border between those two nations is. Sometimes it's good to see cooperation. So I'm glad that some you know bigger powers are stepping up. But it's like, yeah, I mean, it does seem like, you know, it's the Indian government's fault for not thinking about this earlier.
Absolutely, yeah. And like I think that is the big fear on a more global scale than just India, is that, you know, while this vaccine technology is amazing and probably going to change science and medicine in a lot of ways, it's, in my opinion, and I've been listening to some different reports on this, it seems like the vaccine has accelerated an arms race with the virus, mainly because, you know, there's just not enough vaccines getting to people right now. And the problem is it is still infecting the hosts of people who have the vaccine. It's just not actually, you know, exhibiting the symptoms or the hospitalizations, stuff like that. And so the problem is if we have some people with the vaccine, others that don't, then this virus could be mutating amongst people that don't have it. And eventually, if that spike protein, which is the whole idea of the RNA vaccine, if that changes a little bit, we could be in a serious world of hurt. And that's why I think India, to me, is like a kind of a cry for help, for more of a symbolic gesture to kind of what the world still needs to do, is because if there's a mutant that changes enough that this vaccine doesn't work on it, it's going to be a problem. And Brazil, India, some of these places that are having these just giant surges like this, that's where this mutant would come.
Yeah.
And so we need, like, I don't really care if it's the Sinovac or the Sputnik 5 or Pfizer or Moderna, AstraZeneca. To be honest, I don't really care. As long as it works, we need to get it there. And yeah, like you said, I think that's a pro of this, is the response so far has actually been pretty good. Like I saw the US, France, Germany, the British government, they're all talking about, you know, just getting as many supplies and raw materials necessary to India to do this. The Russians actually, I listened to a good episode on the Daily, you know, the New York Times, just kind of daily podcast.
Definitely.
And they talked about how actually in South America, the Sputnik 5 vaccine, Russia's vaccine, actually has more public support than Pfizer and Moderna.
There you go.
And it's
Okay.
because the Russians kind of took a gamble and didn't give the vaccine to their own population, which I think is dumb, but that's a whole other conversation. But instead, they exported it first, and it gave the world kind of a sense like, hey, the Russians are here to help.
Mm.
And so the Russians are a big actor here. From what I've heard, Sputnik 5 is not great. That's a whole other conversation, but it does show that countries understand the problem with India here. And to me, that is something kind of monumental for how divided the world is right now.
Yeah. Uh, it does. I wish we had more global cooperation a year ago, right? Like,
Yeah.
because there is a discrepancy in who's getting the vaccine. Like, again, United States is way ahead, and places like Israel are way ahead of some nations in their vaccination rate. And then on top of that, like you said, is now, India was a supplier exporting more than importing for a while, and now they have this domestic issue where they're going to have to stop exporting to developing countries. So there's also this like domino effect of, okay, well, not only is now India having all these problems and all the vaccines need to go there, well, then all these other countries that were in line to get their vaccines from India are not getting any. So we have to make sure that everyone down this row, this domino effect, it's a global world. This is a further proof that whether you like it or not, we live in a globalized world that requires global solutions. And this is one of those where, yes, a spike in COVID cases in India can actually seriously affect the vaccination rate of an African country or a Southeast Asian country. And of course, you don't have to be a rocket scientist at this point to realize that that infection rate in India can spread outside of India. That's how this whole thing worked in the first place. That's why it's called a pandemic, right? So, yes, it's absolutely a concern to the entire world when a country is experiencing a surge like this. And we absolutely need to be doing everything we can to get not only this solution, but a solution to this problem, but all the problems that are stem from it. Including, I think you had a piece about monetary policy. So what's up with the economic aspects of this problem in India?
well, as we know, or you and I know, and for our listeners who maybe don't know, India has a very strict caste system. It is something where, I guess theoretically, in the U.S., if you were born poor, you could make it out of that to live a decent and comfortable life. In India, it's really not the case. If you're born poor, you are going to probably die poor unless something just insane happens. You're probably more likely to become a movie star being poor and getting out that way than actually just seeing upward mobility. And that's the big problem during the pandemic is that Modi actually originally did a pretty good job of responding. India had some of the strictest lockdowns in the country, and kind of what happened from there is that like everywhere else, it really hurt the essential workers, the working class, the poor. And India now basically is kind of rushing to deal with that. And they're probably going to see close to 5 or 6% inflation, which is not big if you're comparing it to Venezuela or Cuba, but it's still a pretty significant change. And they're going to see some issues inside of their markets, the bond markets, etc. And to me, it's actually going to probably make this situation worse in some ways because we're going to see a growing divide between the haves and the have-nots in India. And I read a great article, which is kind of linked to the market, but not. And it's called India is What Happens When the Rich Do Nothing. And it's from The Atlantic. And it basically says that this current fiscal crisis and this potential current monetary crisis are just going to actually make the hospital system worse, mainly because India's caste system is very prevalent in the healthcare system. And in the 1990s, India industrialized and liberalized quite quickly. And unfortunately, though, they privatized their healthcare system. And so if you had enough money, you could easily just pay into it and get world-class care. Let's remember that India is one of the leaders in science, technology, and medicine.
Yeah.
And so if you can pay to do it, you're doing amazing. The problem is the Atlantic calls this, let's see, I have it here. Actually, I don't have it here, but the Atlantic basically called it a healthcare apartheid. where you just had a completely split system for two different groups of people.
Right.
And the problem is the rich never really actually agreed with a lot of this, but they've been silent. And now, what, 30 years later, there's a completely crumbling public health infrastructure. And arguably, that is what is happening now. So, between the state throwing money into trying to just give people oxygen, I mean, there's reports of having to do cremations on the streets.
Yeah, that's bad.
There is just not infrastructure there. But then the rich either go overseas or pay into a private system. But the rich have kind of remained silent. But now it's getting weird because India tried to skip these steps to kind of liberalize their economy in the 90s. And they're realizing that no one is safe until everyone is safe, because now you have rich and poor alike dying on the streets. And it's come to the point where I think some fingers need to be pointed at what has India been doing. Yes, they focused on infrastructure over the last year, but a year of infrastructure work is not going to fix 30 years of decline.
Right.
And between that and these bond markets potentially just spiraling and inflation, the world is probably going to need to intervene.
We're seeing inflation rise in a ton of places. I know in Brazil it's going crazy. In Russia, there's really intense inflation, where you have buying 50% of your buying power is gone within 4 years. I mean, just crazy. And like, I'm coming to find that when we hear about hyperinflation in Venezuela, right? That's like, but that's kind of a that's a crazy case, right? But the reality is I'm hearing about inflation in a lot of parts of the world, a lot of developed parts of the world, and so I think it's a big problem we're gonna have to face kind of post-pandemic. Is like the long-term recovery of economies is obviously we've seen already that the uber wealthy have quickly recovered, if not become wealthier over the last year, but there's going to be I think billions of people that are going to feel a 10-15% inflation hike, or massive increase in the price of goods, that's really going to affect really affect the bottom rungs of society, if it's not already doing so. I think it is already doing so. Like I said, I hear anecdotal stories from Russia and Brazil all the time about how inflation is going crazy, and now you have it in India as well. I wonder if we are due for like an aftershock recession. Like, how in earthquakes you have sometimes there's a big earthquake and then there's a bigger one or just as big one 15 minutes later. I wonder if you had that COVID dip and then the recovery and then a post-COVID aftershock because of these lingering institutional problems with economies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to talk about, actually, is because it does seem like there's a giant elephant in the room that is getting fatter and fatter by the day, and it's inflation. And in the U.S., we're in this weird quagmire with it, where you kind of have Republicans that are now all of a sudden terrified about the debt, even though obviously Trump, raised it by about $5 trillion, I want to say. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was about $5 trillion. But now all of a sudden the Republicans are terrified. They say hyperinflation is going to happen and we're going to see a recession. And they could be right. But again, it's this weird double standard. But then the left in a lot of the West, especially the U.S., says, well, there's no proof that something like Biden's stimulus will actually influence inflation. And the problem is that we just haven't seen it yet, man. Yeah. That's the problem, is we don't actually know. No one knows. No economists on either side actually know what is going to happen. But this almost $2 trillion stimulus that Biden put into play, I do worry that the costs of goods and everything are going to go up, but the money's not going to keep running. And, I am definitely not an expert on inflation and all these types of factors, but to me, it just seems that eventually there's going to be a point where it breaks. And we don't know where that point is, but it just seems like inflation is becoming an ever worrying issue during this. And it's probably just an extra factor on top of all the other things we need to figure out. But it does seem like everyone wants to just spend to get out of this and then kind of have a roaring 20s type of vibe. But I think we all forget that the roaring 20s about 100 years ago ended in the Great Depression.
Right.
And I think we need to be careful.
Certainly we need to be careful. I do know that the Federal Reserve just recently decided not to change its interest rates policy because they actually felt that inflation in the United States wasn't that bad. It was within what they felt a healthy change, which I thought was interesting. But that's like, but that doesn't necessarily mean like on the global scale it's the same, right? In fact, like one of the main things is that these people that I know and follow from Brazil and Russia and stuff, they're talking about how they constantly follow their currency versus the dollar, because the dollar is so strong right now and their currency's not. That's the thing. They've lost like 50% of their buying power in like 4 years, while the dollar has been pretty okay even throughout the turmoil of COVID. And so, yeah, I mean, I do worry about inflation. I'm not so worried about inflation just out of pure government spending. But it's more about what the Federal Reserve does with monetary policy, really. And frankly, they don't think inflation's an issue in the United States. So it's this weird. It is a weird situation where I see it rising all over the world, but I guess we're okay here. But just regarding inflation, obviously a lot of people, that are hurting from the COVID pandemic, they're still unemployed or still on unemployment insurance. Even 4 or 5%, 2-3% inflation is still going to hurt them a lot. Anyway, back to India. I mean, that's just so. Anyway, back to India, right? As on top of this viral wall slam we're seeing, is there's longer term economic implications, and we're seeing inflation being one of them.
Absolutely, and I think another elephant in the room. I guess we're living amongst elephants in this episode. But anyways, like it seems to me like maybe the COVAX, World Health Organization, other bodies, maybe we don't want to put most of our vaccine infrastructure in one country.
True.
Let's see. I have it here. I highlighted it. Okay, 92 developing nations are currently relying on India at the Serum Institute, which makes the AstraZeneca vaccine. And okay, so what happens when this Serum Institute can't open because a quarter of their people are dying of COVID or are sick with COVID and they don't have the supplies, the economy's collapsing? I think we maybe need to look at what is happening here to the point where we have one country that has such a focus on this. And luckily, there are German factories that are actually looking at building infrastructure. I think it's outside of Frankfurt, if my memory serves me right, that are trying to maybe make up some of this ground. Also, Joe Biden and the U.S. Are actually talking about, sending just raw materials and ventilators, oxygen, the simple things, honestly, the simple things that Modi should have been doing instead of going to these rallies or these Ganges ceremonies for Hinduism. No, I'm fine with religion, but during a pandemic, maybe he should have been making sure his own country, had its things. But I think this is going to maybe remind the world that we can't just rely on one place to be the pharmacy of the world.
And yeah, and that this is not like we have to stop treating this as like individual nations with their own domestic problems, right? We have, I think a lot of these, especially these tough guy archetype leaders, even though like Modi. I mean, Modi's really gone more into that role, and Bolsonaro and previously Trump have all tried to like figure it out themselves and play it down. And I'm a tough guy. We're gonna get through it. I'll figure it out. And it's like, no, that's not worked, man. And now everyone pays the price. Like the global community pays the price for these hard-headed, hard-headed tough guy leaders. It's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that America did really bad at first, and then Brazil is still doing terrible with the COVID response, and then now India's doing really bad. It's like, it's no coincidence when you have a leader that is so nationalistic and that doesn't really think of global solutions. Gosh, here we go. This is just like evidence of like things that we've been saying for a while. And it's really sad because, like you said, it's like the images we're getting out of India are literally like what we saw out of Italy a year ago, where it's like whole towns where it's like, yeah, a generation of old people in this town are just getting cremated in mass burials. It's like, what the hell? So yeah, it's really sad. I really do hope that the global community can continue to do what they need to do. I also saw one of the solutions was working with the World Trade Organization, I believe, to less weaken the regulations on the patents around vaccinations. I think that's a good idea. In cases of emergency, let's not worry about, the patent. Let's just get the vaccine out. Especially in a pandemic, right? It should not be about greed. It should be about public health. So there's things that are happening that are good. I'm glad that the global community is responding in such a good way. But it's damn India. It's like, come on, man, come on, Modi.
Yeah, and two things real quick, if I can, before we
Sure.
Is first, unfortunately, like I was telling you, I think before we started recording, I'm a glass half empty guy. Keeps me humble. But I'm looking at the other populists / nationalists around the world. Brazil's, Jair Bolsonaro, he's still doing fine. His numbers actually haven't gone down in popularity as much as people thought.
Crazy.
Boris Johnson's actually seen a resurgence. Viktor Orban, well, he's destroyed all media against him, so we don't really know. Rodrigo Duterte, another COVID denier, he's doing fine. Trump was the only casualty of bad COVID management, and that's because we live in, as much as we want to criticize certain things, we do live in quite a robust democracy that you pay. And the problem is Modi controls the media. There's reports of Twitter blackouts of people that are trying to report the actual numbers inside of India. And so it seems like Modi controls the media and his party is slowly sweeping each state in India. So Modi will probably do fine, even if thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands more people die, which unfortunately right now it looks like is probably very likely. My other issue, though, is that India, to me, is a warning. Again, like going back to the vaccine, I would consider this RNA vaccine somewhat of a leaky vaccine. Not like to diss it, because I think both of us have taken the Pfizer one, and I'm glad to be vaccinated. But the problem is if we keep jumping science, and keep just approving this vaccine, I am worried that there's going to be repercussions, because there's something called the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, and it talks about how we accept things. Like I'm dumbing this. I'm just summarizing this, but it's like we're dumbing down ideas basically, and we just accept things that are good as being always good. But unless you stand for them and fight for them, then what's the point? It's like the Supreme Court or Congress or democracy. It's like you can accept it and think it's great, but unless you remember how to keep maintaining it, then it's not going to last. And I'm worried that with science right now, we need to make sure that we are approving and really looking into these vaccines, because we don't want short-term gains for long-term pains. And the problem is in India right now with these triple and double mutants, if we do jump the steps and people are still getting infected, even if the virus doesn't actually kill them because of the vaccine, that virus is mutating in ways that it was not supposed to mutate. And that's what I'm worried about, is that India might be the case of this virus could be here to stay for a while. But again, I'm glass half empty guy. So.
Well, it certainly could. I mean, I keep hearing that this is going to turn into a yearly shot. Like it's just going to be it's going to be like another just flu shot. You're just going to have to get it every year. So you're probably right. It is going to be here to stay. That's the reality of viruses.
We just have to hope that it doesn't mutate worse than better. And usually viruses, kind of weaken as they spread through the population. But that's the fear, is that because people are still getting it, but they're vaccinated from the long-term effects, that maybe this virus is changing in ways that naturally it wouldn't. And so that's what worries me about India, is there's so many people that maybe there is going to be a mutation that could be dangerous. But anyways, that's a whole other conversation. I'll stop there. Sorry.
No, don't worry. I mean, that's a good point. So yeah, I mean, we have in front of us a big red warning sign that says, hey, you're not out of the woods yet. And I think we need to be working as an active global community to help stop this. And I think we hammered it home as far as like the reasons still existed in India is why something like this could still happen within a few weeks of being what they considered okay. The caste system, the inactivity of the government, the issue with the vaccine exportation and now importation, right? So I hope that to our listeners that give you an idea of what the heck is going on in India. And it's also a good segue what you just said about all these dictators that I think would have considered failed COVID responses, yet they still have popular support. Is our next episode we're going to be talking about that issue of sometimes people, especially those at the bottom of the totem pole, often vote against their own interests. And so we'll take a look into that and what that even means. So thank you all for listening to this episode of the Tonic Accord, and take care.
Thank you.